Imagine firing a weapon at the enemy, and it kills you instead. For 2 years, American submarines prowled the Pacific hunting Japanese warships with a weapon that was more dangerous to them than to the enemy. The Mark 14 torpedo, the U.S. Navy's most advanced underwater weapon, failed up to 90% of the time. Torpedoes exploded prematurely, destroying the periscopes of the submarines that fired them. They ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. They struck targets dead-on and refused to detonate. Submariners watched in horror as their perfect shots turned into nothing but bubbles and wakes, while Japanese destroyers turned toward them with depth charges ready. The worst part, the Navy knew. From 1941 to 1943, submarine commanders sent report after report documenting the failures. They begged for fixes. They provided evidence. They watched their brothers die. And the Bureau of Ordnance, the department responsible for the Mark 14, called them liars, accused them of cowardice, threatened them with court-martial for daring to question the weapon. This is the story of the Mark 14 torpedo disaster, a story of institutional arrogance, deliberate cover-up, and American warriors betrayed by their own Navy. The question that haunts history: how many submariners died because the weapon they trusted was designed to fail? December 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. The Pacific Fleet lies shattered in the shallow waters of Oahu. America's battleships, the symbols of naval power, are gone. Sunk, capsized, or burning. In a single morning, Japan has rewritten the rules of naval warfare, and America has lost its primary offensive weapon. But beneath the waves, another force remains untouched: the silent service. 51 submarines scattered across the Pacific, ready to strike back. These boats become America's only offensive capability in the first desperate months of the war. While the nation rebuilds its surface fleet, submarines must carry the fight alone. Their mission is brutally simple: sink everything flying the rising sun, choke Japan's supply lines, starve the empire of oil, food, ammunition, and reinforcements. The pressure is enormous. Japan controls an area spanning from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, thousands of miles of conquered territory. Every day, convoys move across these waters carrying the resources that fuel Japan's war machine: Indonesian oil, Malaysian rubber, Chinese steel, Filipino food. If the submarines can sever these arteries, Japan will bleed. If they fail, the war in the Pacific may be lost before it truly begins. The submarine crews understand what's at stake. They're volunteers, every one of them. They know the statistics. Submarines have the highest casualty rate of any branch in the U.S. military. 1 in 5 boats will never return. They accept this. What they don't accept, what they can't accept, is being sent into battle with a weapon that doesn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo represents years of development and millions of dollars. 20 feet long, 3,000 pounds, capable of 46 knots, carrying 600 pounds of high explosive. On paper, it's a marvel of engineering. It features a magnetic exploder designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its spine. A contact exploder as backup. Depth control accurate to within inches. The Navy Bureau of Ordnance calls it the finest torpedo in the world. The submarine crews call it something else. After the first patrols, after the first contact with enemy ships, after watching their perfect shots turn into nothing but white water and disappointment, they call it a dud, a betrayer, a death sentence. Because in submarine warfare, everything depends on the torpedo. A submarine's gun is useless against warships. Its only defense is to hide, to run silent, to avoid detection. When a submarine finally achieves the perfect firing position, after days or weeks of hunting, after risking detection, after maneuvering through destroyer screens, the torpedo must work. One shot, one chance, miss, and the destroyers come hunting with depth charges that can crush a submarine's hull like a tin can. This is the world of the Pacific Submarine War in 1942 and 1943. A world where American warriors face an enemy that fights to the death, in an ocean that offers no mercy, with a weapon that fails them again and again. And somewhere in Washington, In the offices of the Bureau of Ordnance, men in clean uniforms refuse to listen. July 24, 1943. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The submarine USS Tenosa, hull number SS-283, glides away from the dock on her third war patrol. She's a Gato-class boat, 311 feet of welded steel, 80 men, 24 Mark 14 torpedoes. Her commander is Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit, 32 years old, a Naval Academy graduate with ice water in his veins and 2 successful patrols already behind him. His crew trusts him absolutely. They've earned a Navy unit commendation together. They've sent Japanese ships to the bottom together. They're as good as any submarine crew in the Pacific. Their patrol area is the Caroline Islands, specifically the waters near Truk Lagoon, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific. Truk is a fortress, a massive naval anchorage surrounded by coral reefs and defended by airfields, destroyers, and patrol boats. Japanese convoys gather here before making runs to the Philippines, to New Guinea, to the embattled garrisons across the South Pacific. For American submarines, Truk approaches are a target-rich environment. They're also a killing ground, where one mistake means depth charges and drowning in the dark. Daspit knows his mission. Find Japanese merchant ships. Sink them. Disrupt the supply lines feeding Japan's war effort. He also knows something else. Something every submarine commander in the Pacific knows by mid-1943, though they're forbidden from saying it openly. The Mark 14 torpedo is fundamentally broken. The weapon has 3 major systems, and all 3 are defective. First, the magnetic exploder, officially called the Mark 6 exploder. It's designed to sense changes in Earth's magnetic field as the torpedo passes beneath a steel ship's hull, then detonate directly under the keel. In theory, this breaks the ship's spine and guarantees a kill. In practice, the magnetic exploder is catastrophically unreliable. Sometimes it detonates prematurely, exploding hundreds of yards before reaching the target. Sometimes it doesn't detonate at all. The Pacific's magnetic field is different from the Atlantic, where it was tested, but the Bureau of Ordnance refuses to acknowledge this. Second, the depth control. The Mark 14 is supposed to run at a preset depth, usually 10 feet, allowing it to pass beneath a ship's waterline before the exploder triggers. But submarine commanders have discovered through bitter experience that the torpedoes run 10 to 12 feet deeper than set. A torpedo set for 10 feet actually runs at 20 feet, passing harmlessly beneath destroyer and cruiser hulls. When submariners report this, the Bureau of Ordnance accuses them of improper maintenance and poor seamanship. Third, the contact exploder, the Mark 5. This backup system is supposed to detonate when the torpedo physically strikes the target's hull. It's a simple firing pin mechanism. Hit something hard, pin drives forward, explosion follows. Except the Mark 5 has never been properly tested with live warheads because live testing is expensive and the Great Depression forced budget cuts. So the Navy tested it with dummy warheads that weigh less and impact differently. The result, when a Mark 14 hits a target at the proper 90-degree angle, a direct, perfect hit, the firing pin crushes backward instead of forward. The torpedo doesn't explode. It just clangs off the enemy hull like a hammer hitting an anvil. Every submarine commander in the Pacific knows this. They've lived it. They've watched textbook-perfect attacks fail because the weapons betrayed them. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo once fired 9 torpedoes at a single Japanese destroyer, 9 direct hits heard by sonar, and got 0 explosions. Commander Howard Gilmore of USS Growler watched torpedoes run 20 feet beneath their targets, then returned to Pearl Harbor with proof and was told he was wrong. Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Trout fired 16 torpedoes during one patrol and got 2 explosions. The submarine force is bleeding, not just from Japanese depth charges and patrol boats, but from their own weapon. And the Bureau of Ordnance, led by Rear Admiral William H.P. Blandy, refuses to admit there's a problem. Blandy is a battleship officer, an ordnance specialist, a man whose career is built on the Mark 14's development. To admit the torpedo is defective means admitting his department failed. means admitting that millions of dollars and years of development produced a weapon that kills American submariners instead of Japanese ships. So Blandy doesn't admit it. He blames the submarine crews. Bad maintenance, poor training, cowardice under fire. Commander after commander returns with evidence, and Admiral Blandy calls them liars to their faces. Dan Daspit knows all this as Tenosa heads toward Truk in July 1943. He knows his torpedoes are likely to fail. He knows the Bureau of Ordnance will blame him if they do. He knows that complaining too loudly about the Mark 14 can end a career or result in a court-martial for defeatist attitudes. But he also knows his job. Find targets, shoot straight, bring his crew home alive. So Tenosa submerges into the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific, running silent, hunting for the enemy. What Daspit doesn't know, what he can't know, is that his third patrol is about to produce the most damning evidence against the Mark 14 ever recorded. Evidence so overwhelming that even the Bureau of Ordnance won't be able to ignore it. Evidence that will be purchased with his crew's sanity and his own career prospects. Evidence written in 15 torpedo wakes and one impossibly lucky Japanese tanker. Tenosa is about to prove, once and for all, that America's submarines have been fighting with a weapon designed to fail. July 24, 1943, 400 miles north of Truk. The Pacific stretches empty and blue in every direction, its surface calm, its depths hiding death. USS Tenosa runs submerged at periscope depth, her crew at battle stations, every man silent and sweating in the tropical heat. The air inside smells of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and tension. Commander Daspit stands at the periscope, rotating slowly, scanning the horizon. Then he sees it. A ship. Massive. Alone. Steaming northeast at 12 knots, with no escort. Daspit calls out the bearing and range. The plotting party goes to work, calculating course, speed, distance. The identification comes back quickly. Tonin Maru 3. A brand new Japanese whale factory ship pressed into service as a fleet tanker. 19,000 tons. 600 feet long. Fat with fuel destined for Japanese bases across the Pacific. She's the largest target any American submarine has encountered in months. And she's sailing alone, unescorted, completely vulnerable. This is the shot every submarine commander dreams about. A stationary shooting gallery. No destroyers. No zigzagging. Just one enormous, slow-moving target silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Daspit orders Tenosa into attack position. The boat angles toward the tanker's track, moving into the perfect firing position, 90 degrees to the target's course, 1,500 yards away. The crew loads 4 Mark 14 torpedoes into the forward tubes. The solution is calculated and recalculated. Everything is perfect. Textbook. The kind of attack they practice 100 times in training. Daspit gives the order. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. For torpedoes leap from Tenosa's bow tubes, compressed air hissing, the boat rocking slightly with each launch. Through the periscope, Daspit watches for white wakes streak toward the tanker's hull. The crew counts seconds, calculating time to impact. Everyone holds their breath. This is it. 4 hits. Maybe 5,000 tons of fuel oil going up in flames. A perfect kill. The first torpedo explodes, but not against the tanker's hull. It detonates 200 yards short, a geyser of white water erupting between Tenosa and her target. Premature explosion. The magnetic exploder triggered too early, sensing something, a thermal layer, a magnetic anomaly, a defect in its own mechanism. The second torpedo does the same. The third runs true, reaching the tanker, passing directly beneath her keel, and disappears. No explosion. The depth control sent it too deep, below the magnetic exploder's trigger threshold. The fourth torpedo strikes the tanker's hull with an audible clang that echoes through Tenosa's sonar. Metal on metal. A perfect 90-degree hit. And nothing happens. The contact exploder fails. The torpedo bounces off the hull and sinks into the Pacific. Inside Tenosa, 80 men stare at each other in disbelief. 4 torpedoes. 4 failures. 4 different failure modes. And the tanker keeps steaming, completely unaware she's just survived an attack. Daspit isn't finished. He's been on enough patrols to know the torpedoes fail, but he's never had a target this perfect, this vulnerable. He repositions Tenosa, calculating a new firing solution. He fires for more torpedoes. The crew watches through the periscope as the wakes converge on the tanker. 2 explode prematurely. 1 runs deep and vanishes. 1 hits the hull, they hear the impact through sonar, and fails to detonate. 8 torpedoes. 8 failures. The tanker is still afloat, still steaming, now aware something is happening, but unable to understand what. She has no escorts to call, no ability to run. Tenosa is faster submerged than WWII is on the surface. The tanker is trapped, and she doesn't even know it. Commander Daspit makes a decision that defines his career and possibly save his life. He surfaces Tenosa, in daylight, in enemy waters, within gun range of a ship that could ram and sink his submarine. His crew thinks he's lost his mind. But Daspit has calculated that WWII has no armament, no radio powerful enough to call for help, and nowhere to run. He brings Tenosa's 5-inch deck gun into action and begins shelling the tanker from 3,000 yards. For 30 minutes, Tenosa's gun crew pounds the tanker with high-explosive shells. They score hit after hit. Holes appear in the tanker's hull. Fires start on deck. Black smoke billows into the tropical sky. But WWII refuses to sink. She's too large, too compartmentalized. The 5-inch gun can wound her but can't kill her. And every minute Tenosa remains on the surface is another minute a Japanese patrol plane could appear over the horizon. Daspit orders a ceasefire. Tenosa submerges again. The tanker is listing now, burning, dead in the water. She's not going anywhere. Daspit repositions for another torpedo attack. He's used 8 torpedoes and 45 shells. He has 16 torpedoes remaining. He's going to use them. All of them if necessary. Because this isn't about sinking one tanker anymore. This is about proof. This is about evidence that even the Bureau of Ordnance can't deny. Daspit fires again. Another spread of 4 torpedoes. The crew watches the wakes converge on the crippled tanker. 1 premature explosion. 2 run deep. 1 hits and fails to explode. The sonar operator reports the impact. Metal on metal. No detonation. 12 torpedoes fired. 12 failures. The crew's morale is collapsing. These are trained warriors, men who faced Japanese destroyers and survived depth charge attacks. But this is different. This is watching their weapon betray them again and again. This is helplessness. This is rage with nowhere to go. Some men are crying. Some are cursing. Some stare at the bulkheads in silence, wondering if they'll die on the next patrol because their torpedoes won't work when a destroyer is bearing down on them. Daspit keeps firing. Another spread. Another set of failures. Then another. The numbers climb. 13 failures, 14, 15. Each torpedo wake is another document in a case file that's been building for 2 years. Each dud is another piece of evidence. Each clang against the tanker's hull is another condemnation of the Bureau of Ordnance's arrogance. By the time Daspit stops, he's fired 15 torpedoes at point-blank range at a stationary target. 15 perfect shots. Only one, the very first, exploded, and even that one detonated prematurely and did minimal damage. 14 duds. 14 pieces of proof that the Mark 14 torpedo is fundamentally, catastrophically broken. Daspit makes one final decision. He has 9 torpedoes remaining. He fires 8 of them at maximum spread, hoping sheer volume will overcome the defects. 6 miss entirely because the depth control sends them under the hull. 2 hit and fail to explode. Commander Daspit secures from battle stations. He orders Tenosa to withdraw. He has 1 torpedo left, 1 single Mark 14, and he's keeping it. He's taking it back to Pearl Harbor as evidence. He's going to hand it to the Bureau of Ordnance and make them explain why it didn't work. Behind Tenosa, WWII burns and lists, but refuses to sink. She'll eventually be salvaged by the Japanese and returned to service. She survives because American torpedoes don't work. And Commander Dan Daspit is about to start a war with his own Navy. August 9, 1943, Pearl Harbor. USS Tenosa ties up at the submarine base, and before the lines are even secured, Commander Dan Daspit is off the boat and marching toward headquarters. His uniform is stained with sweat and salt. His face is granite. His crew watches him go, knowing what's coming. The other submarine commanders know too. Word spreads through the base within minutes. Daspit fired 24 torpedoes at a sitting target and sank nothing. The Bureau of Ordnance representative meets Daspit in the debriefing room. The conversation is professional at first. Patrol summary. Contacts made. Tonnage claimed. Then Daspit reaches the part about Tonin Maru 3. He describes the attack methodically, emotionlessly, like a prosecutor reading charges. 15 torpedoes fired. 14 duds. 1 premature detonation. A 19,000-ton tanker that should be on the bottom of the Pacific is still afloat because American torpedoes are worthless. The ordnance officer begins the usual response, the same response submarine commanders have heard for 2 years. Perhaps the depth settings were incorrect. Perhaps the firing solution had errors. Perhaps the crew failed to properly maintain the torpedoes. Perhaps Commander Daspit should review attack doctrine. Daspit doesn't let him finish. He describes surfacing Tenosa in daylight. Describes shelling the tanker for 30 minutes. Describes firing again and again at a target that wasn't maneuvering, wasn't shooting back, wasn't even moving. He describes the sonar operator calling out impact after impact, metal striking metal, with no explosions. He describes his crew's faces as they realized their weapon was killing them more surely than any Japanese destroyer. Then Daspit produces his evidence, the patrol report with detailed attack data, firing angles, ranges, depths, times, eyewitness testimony from 80 men, and 1 unfired Mark 14 torpedo in Tenosa's forward torpedo room, a torpedo he deliberately kept instead of shooting because he knew he'd need physical proof that couldn't be dismissed as operator error. The ordnance officer stiffens. Bringing back an unfired torpedo violates doctrine. Torpedoes cost $10,000 each. They're meant to be used in combat, not saved for bureaucratic arguments. Daspit's response is simple. You can have the torpedo, right after you explain why the other 15 didn't work. The meeting ends badly. Daspit is told the matter will be investigated. He's told to return to his boat. He's told in carefully chosen words that publicly criticizing Bureau of Ordnance equipment is conduct unbecoming an officer. The implied threat is clear. Push this too hard and your career ends. Daspit doesn't care. His crew nearly died because of defective torpedoes. Other crews have died. And the men responsible are more concerned with protecting their reputations than fixing the weapon. But Daspit isn't alone anymore. By August 1943, the submarine force is in open rebellion. Commander after commander is refusing to stay silent. USS WWII's patrol report documents 9 direct hits with 0 explosions. USS Growler's commander physically measured his torpedo depth settings and proved they run 10 feet deeper than set. USS Trigger's skipper fired 16 torpedoes on 1 patrol and got 2 detonations. The patrol reports pile up in Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of pages of documentation describing the same failures over and over. Premature explosions, deep running, dud contact hits. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, has had enough. Lockwood is a submariner, not a desk officer. He commanded submarines in the peacetime Navy. He knows his commanders aren't lying. He knows his crews aren't incompetent. And he knows the Bureau of Ordnance has been stonewalling him for 2 years. But Daspit's patrol report is different. It's irrefutable. 24 torpedoes fired at a stationary target. 23 failures. That's not operator error. That's systemic defect. Lockwood orders immediate testing. Not Bureau of Ordnance testing. Not theoretical calculations. Real testing. They take a Mark 14 torpedo, remove the warhead, load it with instrumentation, and fire it at a fishing net suspended at known depth. The torpedo runs 11 feet deeper than set. They fire another. Same result. They fire 10 more with different depth settings. Every single one runs deep. The depth control mechanism, designed during the Depression and never properly tested, because testing was expensive, is fundamentally miscalibrated. Lockwood fixes the depth control problem with field modifications. It's a simple mechanical adjustment. Could have been done in 1941. Should have been done before the war started. Wasn't, because the Bureau of Ordnance insisted the design was perfect. Next test, the magnetic exploder. They fire torpedoes beneath a derelict ship with magnetic exploder armed. Some detonate prematurely. Some don't detonate at all. The magnetic field in the Pacific is different from the Atlantic. The temperature differences affect the exploder's sensitivity. The Earth's magnetic variations near the equator confuse the sensor. All of this should have been discovered during pre-war testing. Wasn't, because the Bureau of Ordnance tested in the Atlantic and assumed the Pacific would be identical. Lockwood orders the magnetic exploder deactivated fleet-wide. Every submarine commander is instructed to disarm the Mark VI and rely solely on contact detonation. The Bureau of Ordnance protests violently. The magnetic exploder is the Mark XIV's revolutionary feature. Disabling it reduces the weapon to a conventional torpedo. Lockwood's response: a conventional torpedo that works is better than a revolutionary torpedo that kills my men. But the contact exploder is still broken. Submarines return from patrols reporting hits with no detonations. Daspit's evidence is too overwhelming to ignore. In September 1943, 2 years into the war, Lockwood conducts the test that should have been done in 1935. They fire torpedoes at perpendicular angles against steel cliff faces in Hawaii. The torpedoes hit the cliffs at full speed, exactly as they'd hit an enemy hull, and fail to detonate 70% of the time. The firing pin mechanism crushes instead of striking forward. It's a design flaw so fundamental that anyone who tested the Mark V exploder with live warheads would have discovered it immediately. The Bureau of Ordnance never tested it with live warheads. Too expensive. Too dangerous. So they tested with dummies and assumed the real weapon would function identically. It didn't. For 8 years, through development, through trials, through 2 years of war, no one in the Bureau of Ordnance thought to test whether the exploder actually exploded. Admiral Lockwood's ordnance officers redesigned the firing pin mechanism in 3 weeks. It's not sophisticated. It's not elegant. But it works. They manufacture new firing pins and retrofit the entire Pacific submarine fleet. By October 1943, the Mark XIV torpedo finally functions as designed. 2 years late. Thousands of failures, too late. And the question everyone in the submarine force asks, but no one answers officially: how many men died because the Bureau of Ordnance was too proud to admit was wrong? Commander Dan Daspit returns to sea in USS Tenosa for a 4th patrol. His torpedoes work now. He sinks 2 Japanese cargo ships and damages a cruiser. He's awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the Tonin-Maru 3 attack, specifically for his persistence and for providing evidence that led to fixing the Mark XIV. But his career never reaches the heights it should. He never gets his own submarine squadron, never makes admiral, because in the peacetime Navy, being right isn't enough. Making the Bureau of Ordnance look bad, even when they deserved it, carries consequences. The Mark XIV torpedo scandal doesn't end with the fixes. It metastasizes into questions that the Navy doesn't want asked. How many submarines were lost because their weapons failed at critical moments? How many convoys escaped because American torpedoes were duds? How many Japanese warships survived to fight another day? How much longer did the war last? Because for 2 years, America's primary offensive weapon in the Pacific was statistically more likely to fail than succeed. And the darkest question of all: how many submariners died knowing their weapon would betray them? 52 submarines. 52 American boats that left port and never returned. 3,700 men who went down with their vessels. entombed in steel coffins somewhere in the Pacific's darkness. The official Navy records list them as lost to enemy action, depth charges, torpedoes, mines, collisions. And many were. But the question that haunts the silent service for the rest of the war, the question that haunts it still, is simpler and more terrible. How many of those boats died because their torpedoes failed when it mattered most? USS Wahoo. Submarine SS 238. Lost October 11, 1943, in the Sea of Japan with all 80 hands including her legendary commander, Dudley Mushmorton. Japanese records indicate Wahoo was caught on the surface and bombed by aircraft. But Wahoo's patrol reports from earlier missions document catastrophic torpedo failures. 9 direct hits on 1 destroyer with 0 explosions. Did Morton surface because his torpedoes failed and he had no other way to fight? Did he die because he couldn't trust his primary weapon? The Navy doesn't know. Cannot know. Wahoo took those answers to the bottom. USS Tang. Submarine SS 306. Sunk October 25, 1944, not by Japanese forces, but by her own torpedo. Commander Richard O'Kane fired a spread at a Japanese transport. 1 torpedo malfunctioned, circled back, and struck Tang's stern. She went down in minutes. 9 men survived. 78 drowned. O'Kane himself, the most successful submarine commander in American history, spent the war's final months in a Japanese prison camp because a Mark 14 torpedo killed his own boat. Even in late 1944, after all the fixes, the Mark 14 was still finding ways to murder the men who trusted it. USS Growler. Submarine SS 215. Lost November 1944 with all hands. USS Escalar. Lost October 1944 with all hands. USS Albacore. Lost November 1944 with all hands. The list goes on. Boats that vanished without a trace. Crews that never came home. And for each one, the question remains suspended in history like a ghost. Did their torpedoes fail at the moment of crisis? When that Japanese destroyer was bearing down on them, depth charges ready, did they fire their last torpedoes and watch them dud out? Did they die knowing that their own Navy's incompetence had sealed their fate? The statistics are damning. From December 1941 to September 1943, 22 months, American submarines fired approximately 6,000 torpedoes in combat. Conservative estimates suggest 60 to 70% failed to function properly. That's 4,000 torpedoes. 4,000 shots at Japanese ships that should have exploded and didn't. 4,000 opportunities to shorten the war wasted. At $10,000 per torpedo, that's $40 million, over $700 million in today's money, spent on weapons that were statistically more likely to fail than succeed. But the cost in dollars is meaningless compared to the cost in lives. Submarines that failed to sink enemy destroyers because their torpedoes were duds often found themselves hunted by those same destroyers hours later. Boats that expended all their torpedoes on targets that wouldn't die had nothing left for the convoy escorts that came hunting. Commanders who lost confidence in their weapons made different tactical decisions, riskier decisions, more aggressive decisions, trying to compensate for torpedo failures. And those decisions got men killed. The testimony from survivors is fragmentary but brutal. Clay Blair's history of the submarine war quotes unnamed submariners describing the psychological toll. We stopped believing in anything. We'd line up the perfect shot, fire, watch the wake run true, hear it hit, and nothing. You can't fight when you don't trust your weapon. It's like going into battle with a rifle that jams 2 times out of 3. Eventually, you stop aiming. You just pull the trigger and pray. Commander George Grider, executive officer of USS Flasher, wrote in his memoir, "The torpedo scandal was worse than the enemy. At least we could fight the Japanese. We couldn't fight our own Bureau of Ordnance. They were killing us from 6,000 miles away, and there was nothing we could do about it except die quietly and let them blame us for their failures." The official Navy investigation, when it finally came in late 1943, was damning in what it didn't say. The report confirmed all 3 major defects: depth control running 10 feet deep, magnetic exploder unreliable, contact exploder failing on perpendicular hits. The report documented that these problems existed from the war start. The report noted that submarine commanders had reported these failures consistently since December 1941. But the report never assigned blame. No one in the Bureau of Ordnance was court-martialed. No one was relieved of command. No one faced consequences for sending men to war with a weapon that failed 70% of the time and lying about it for 2 years. Rear Admiral William Blandy, the Bureau of Ordnance chief who called submarine commanders liars, who threatened them with courts-martial for criticizing the Mark 14, who insisted for 2 years that the torpedo was perfect and the submariners were incompetent, was promoted to vice admiral in 1944. He went on to command the naval component of the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. He retired with full honors. No black mark on his record. No mention of the Mark 14 disaster in his official biography. The Navy's official submarine casualty list doesn't break down losses by cause, doesn't distinguish between submarines sunk by enemy action and submarines that might have survived if their weapons worked. The number 52 is absolute and final. But buried in patrol reports, in survivor testimonies, in declassified action reports, the evidence suggests the true number is higher. How much higher? 10 boats? 15? 20? The Navy doesn't know and has never tried to calculate. Some questions are too dangerous to answer. By the war's end, after all fixes were implemented, American submarines became the deadliest force in the Pacific. They sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships, 5 million tons of shipping. They sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship and 8 carriers. They strangled Japan's economy. They starved the empire. They turned the Pacific into a graveyard for the rising sun. But that success came after October 1943, after the Mark 14 was finally fixed. For the first 2 years, the most critical years when Japan was strongest and America was desperately fighting for survival, the submarine force fought with one hand tied behind its back. The submariners themselves never forgot. Long after the war, at reunion dinners and memorial services, the Mark 14 remained a bitter memory. They forgave the Japanese for fighting. They forgave the chaos of war. They never forgave the Bureau of Ordnance for lying. They never forgave Admiral Blandy for calling them cowards. They never forgave the Navy for valuing bureaucratic pride over American lives. And they never stopped wondering, how many empty chairs at the reunion tables were filled with men who died because someone in Washington was too proud to admit a mistake? The story the Navy told was simple. The Mark 14 torpedo had teething problems. All new weapon systems have bugs. The submarine force identified the issues. The Bureau of Ordnance fixed them. Wartime development is messy. Mistakes happen. Move forward. But that story, the official version that went into history books and Navy archives, is a lie. The Bureau of Ordnance knew. Not suspected. Not theorized. Knew. With certainty. Before Pearl Harbor was attacked. Before the war even started. They knew the Mark 14 torpedo was defective, and they sent submariners to war with it anyway. The evidence remained classified for decades, buried in Bureau of Ordnance files marked secret, and later downgraded to confidential before finally being declassified in the 1970s during the general document releases following the Freedom of Information Act. Historians combing through naval archives discovered what amounted to a smoking gun. Pre-war test reports from 1938 through 1941 documenting every single failure mode that would later kill American submariners. The magnetic exploder failed pre-war tests. In 1938, during trials off Newport, Rhode Island, Mark 14 torpedoes with magnetic exploders detonated prematurely in 17% of test runs. The Bureau of Ordnance response was not to fix the exploder. It was to stop testing it. Live warhead testing was expensive. Each test cost thousands of dollars. The Great Depression had cut the Navy's budget. So after 1938, the Bureau of Ordnance conducted no further live tests of the magnetic exploder. They declared it operational based on 17 successful detonations and ignored the premature failures. The depth control problem was documented in 1941. A Bureau of Ordnance engineer named Gilbert Hoover conducted sea trials and discovered that Mark 14 torpedoes consistently ran deeper than their depth settings indicated. He wrote a detailed report explaining the issue. The depth sensor was calibrated for the torpedo's weight without a warhead, but in combat, the added weight of 600 pounds of Torpex explosive changed the torpedo's buoyancy characteristics. The math was simple. The solution was simple. Recalibrate the depth sensor for combat-loaded weight. Hoover submitted his report in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The Bureau of Ordnance classified the report and shelved it. Admiral William Blandy's personal notation on the file, discovered years later, reads, "Recalibration would require factory recalls and modifications to all existing torpedoes. Cost prohibitive. Field commanders will adjust depth settings as needed." In other words, we know it's broken, we're not fixing it, and we'll let the submarine crews figure it out under combat conditions. The contact exploder was never tested properly, ever. The Mark V contact exploder's development files reveal that every single live-fire test from 1935 to 1941 was conducted with dummy warheads filled with water instead of explosive. The dummy warheads weighed significantly less than live warheads, which meant they impacted targets with less force and at different angles. Multiple Bureau of Ordnance engineers recommended live-fire testing with actual explosive warheads. All such recommendations were denied due to cost concerns and safety regulations. In 1940, a Bureau of Ordnance physicist named Dr. Alva Thompson submitted a theoretical analysis predicting that the Mark V firing pin would fail on perpendicular impacts above 35 knots because the deceleration forces would crush the pin backward instead of driving it forward. His analysis included mathematical models and materials science data. He recommended either live-fire testing to confirm his theory or a redesign of the firing mechanism. His report was filed and ignored. After the war, when questioned by Navy investigators, Thompson stated, "I told them it wouldn't work. They told me I was a theorist who didn't understand practical engineering. Then they sent boys to die with weapons I knew were broken." Perhaps most damningly, the Bureau of Ordnance had evidence from foreign navies. German U-boats in World War I experienced identical magnetic exploder failures. German naval engineering reports, captured after World War I and translated by U.S. naval intelligence, documented premature detonations and unreliable performance. Those reports were in Bureau of Ordnance files. They were read, they were noted, and they were disregarded because American engineering was assumed to be superior. So why did the Bureau of Ordnance hide these problems? Why did they send the submarine force to war with a weapon they knew was defective? The declassified correspondence reveals 3 reasons, each more damning than the last. First, budget protection. The Mark 14 torpedo program consumed millions of Depression-era dollars across 15 years of development. Admitting fundamental design flaws meant congressional investigations, budget cuts, and possible program cancellation. Admiral Blandy and his staff chose to protect the program instead of the submariners. Second, career preservation. The officers responsible for Mark 14 development had staked their professional reputations on the weapon. Blandy himself supervised much of the magnetic exploder work. Admitting failure meant ending careers, accepting responsibility, possibly facing courts-martial for negligence. They chose to blame submarine commanders instead. Third, bureaucratic inertia. By 1941, the Navy had stockpiled over 2,000 Mark 14 torpedoes. Factories were tooled for production. Supply chains were established. Doctrine was written around the weapon. Admitting the torpedo was fundamentally broken meant recalling and modifying thousands of units, halting production, retraining crews, rewriting doctrine. The Bureau of Ordnance decided it was easier to pretend the weapon worked and let the war sort out the problems. They gambled with American lives. And when submarine commanders reported failures, when they provided evidence, when they begged for fixes, the Bureau of Ordnance didn't investigate the weapon. They investigated the commanders, checked their training records, questioned their competence, threatened their careers. Because admitting the submariners were right meant admitting the Bureau was wrong, and institutional pride mattered more than institutional honor. The final piece of evidence emerged from Admiral Blandy's personal papers, donated to the Naval Academy archives after his death. A private letter from July 1942, 7 months into the war, to a fellow admiral reads, "The submarine force continues to complain about torpedo performance. Their reports are exaggerated and reflect poor training more than equipment deficiency. I have directed that future complaints be addressed through command channels to ensure accountability." Translation: I'm making it harder for submarine commanders to report problems, so the complaints stop reaching my desk. Admiral Blandy knew. The Bureau of Ordnance knew. And they chose institutional convenience over American lives. The Mark 14 remained a bitter memory. They forgave the Japanese for fighting. They forgave the chaos of war. They never forgave the Bureau of Ordnance for lying. They never forgave Admiral Blandy for calling them cowards. They never forgave the Navy for valuing bureaucratic pride over American lives. And they never stopped wondering, how many empty chairs at the reunion tables were filled with men who died because someone in Washington was too proud to admit a mistake? The story the Navy told was simple. The Mark 14 torpedo had teething problems. All new weapon systems have bugs. The submarine force identified the issues. The Bureau of Ordnance fixed them. Wartime development is messy. Mistakes happen. Move forward. But that story, the official version that went into history books and Navy archives, is a lie. The Bureau of Ordnance knew. Not suspected. Not theorized. Knew. With certainty. Before Pearl Harbor was attacked. Before the war even started. They knew the Mark 14 torpedo was defective, and they sent submariners to war with it anyway. The evidence remained classified for decades, buried in Bureau of Ordnance files marked secret, and later downgraded to confidential before finally being declassified in the 1970s during the general document releases following the Freedom of Information Act. Historians combing through naval archives discovered what amounted to a smoking gun. Pre-war test reports from 1938 through 1941 documenting every single failure mode that would later kill American submariners. The magnetic exploder failed pre-war tests. In 1938, during trials off Newport, Rhode Island, Mark 14 torpedoes with magnetic exploders detonated prematurely in 17% of test runs. The Bureau of Ordnance response was not to fix the exploder. It was to stop testing it. Live warhead testing was expensive. Each test cost thousands of dollars. The Great Depression had cut the Navy's budget. So after 1938, the Bureau of Ordnance conducted no further live tests of the magnetic exploder. They declared it operational based on 17 successful detonations and ignored the premature failures. The depth control problem was documented in 1941. A Bureau of Ordnance engineer named Gilbert Hoover conducted sea trials and discovered that Mark 14 torpedoes consistently ran deeper than their depth settings indicated. He wrote a detailed report explaining the issue. The depth sensor was calibrated for the torpedo's weight without a warhead, but in combat, the added weight of 600 pounds of Torpex explosive changed the torpedo's buoyancy characteristics. The math was simple. The solution was simple. Recalibrate the depth sensor for combat-loaded weight. Hoover submitted his report in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The Bureau of Ordnance classified the report and shelved it. Admiral William Blandy's personal notation on the file, discovered years later, reads, "Recalibration would require factory recalls and modifications to all existing torpedoes. Cost prohibitive. Field commanders will adjust depth settings as needed." In other words, we know it's broken, we're not fixing it, and we'll let the submarine crews figure it out under combat conditions. The contact exploder was never tested properly, ever. The Mark V contact exploder's development files reveal that every single live-fire test from 1935 to 1941 was conducted with dummy warheads filled with water instead of explosive. The dummy warheads weighed significantly less than live warheads, which meant they impacted targets with less force and at different angles. multiple Bureau of Ordnance engineers recommended live-fire testing with actual explosive warheads. All such recommendations were denied due to cost concerns and safety regulations. In 1940, a Bureau of Ordnance physicist named Dr. Alva Thompson submitted a theoretical analysis predicting that the Mark V firing pin would fail on perpendicular impacts above 35 knots because the deceleration forces would crush the pin backward instead of driving it forward. His analysis included mathematical models and materials science data. He recommended either live-fire testing to confirm his theory or a redesign of the firing mechanism. His report was filed and ignored. After the war, when questioned by Navy investigators, Thompson stated, "I told them it wouldn't work. They told me I was a theorist who didn't understand practical engineering. Then they sent boys to die with weapons I knew were broken." Perhaps most damningly, the Bureau of Ordnance had evidence from foreign navies. German U-boats in World War I experienced identical magnetic exploder failures. German naval engineering reports, captured after World War I and translated by U.S. naval intelligence, documented premature detonations and unreliable performance. Those reports were in Bureau of Ordnance files. They were read, they were noted, and they were disregarded because American engineering was assumed to be superior. So why did the Bureau of Ordnance hide these problems? Why did they send the submarine force to war with a weapon they knew was defective? The declassified correspondence reveals 3 reasons, each more damning than the last. First, budget protection. The Mark XIV torpedo program consumed millions of Depression-era dollars across 15 years of development. Admitting fundamental design flaws meant congressional investigations, budget cuts, and possible program cancellation. Admiral Blandy and his staff chose to protect the program instead of the submariners. Second, career preservation. The officers responsible for Mark XIV development had staked their professional reputations on the weapon. Blandy himself supervised much of the magnetic exploder work. Admitting failure meant ending careers, accepting responsibility, possibly facing courts-martial for negligence. They chose to blame submarine commanders instead. Third, bureaucratic inertia. By 1941, the Navy had stockpiled over 2,000 Mark XIV torpedoes. Factories were tooled for production. Supply chains were established. Doctrine was written around the weapon. Admitting the torpedo was fundamentally broken meant recalling and modifying thousands of units, halting production, retraining crews, rewriting doctrine. The Bureau of Ordnance decided it was easier to pretend the weapon worked and let the war sort out the problems. They gambled with American lives. And when submarine commanders reported failures, when they provided evidence, when they begged for fixes, the Bureau of Ordnance didn't investigate the weapon. They investigated the commanders, checked their training records, questioned their competence, threatened their careers. Because admitting the submariners were right meant admitting the Bureau was wrong, and institutional pride mattered more than institutional honor. The final piece of evidence emerged from Admiral Blandy's personal papers, donated to the Naval Academy archives after his death. A private letter from July 1942, 7 months into the war, to a fellow admiral reads, "The submarine force continues to complain about torpedo performance. Their reports are exaggerated and reflect poor training more than equipment deficiency. I have directed that future complaints be addressed through command channels to ensure accountability." Translation: I'm making it harder for submarine commanders to report problems, so the complaints stop reaching my desk. Admiral Blandy knew. The Bureau of Ordnance knew. And they chose institutional convenience over American lives.